The Star Wars video games also got in on the 10-year challenge Facebook meme, which is actually a malicious grassroots strat in order to get training data for the machine learning of some sort of facial recognition algorithm for age progression. Anyways, tinfoil hat aside, we can see here that from 2002 through 2006, without an exclusive license to one publisher, LucasArts and Star Wars enjoyed a healthy, diverse library of video games, and this isn't even with movie tie-ins in order to boost sales. From 2013, when EA got the exclusive license for the same time period until 2017, there's only 2 Star Wars games that have been released, and both of which aren't even actually original ideas. They're reboots of 2 games in the former list, and there have actually been yearly movies, which increases the visibility of the franchise and should make for a higher sales potential. The problem is that EA has squandered the license away with its complete mismanagement of assets. EA's mishandling of the Star Wars license isn't just bad for Star Wars fans, it's also really bad for one of its flagship franchises, Battlefield, and to a lesser extent the franchise that I love with Titanfall. But let me lay some foundation here. The first Battlefront reboot was released in 2015 with absolutely no campaign and so little content in it due to it being rushed in order to meet a deadline for one of those aforementioned movie tie-ins. The rest of the content was padded out if you actually shelled out the extra $50 for the season pass, which leaves you to wonder if this was almost done on purpose in order to extort more money out of fans. I played the demo, beta, and was underwhelmed by the entire ordeal, especially considering that I'm not a big Star Wars fan to begin with. The sequel to the empty husk of the Star Wars Sandbox reboot was then released in 2017 that actually had a campaign and some more content. However, it's most remembered for being the catalyst to finally get governments around the world involved in the predatory business practices of loot boxes, aka casinos masquerading as things kids play when they're bored. EA completely showed their hand here with this title, putting pay-to-win mechanics behind an RNG wall, and got the most downvoted Reddit post of all time by using the now meme-worthy phrase, "a sense of pride and accomplishment," as justification for making the game so exhaustingly grindy unless you stole your mom's credit card in order to gain an in-game advantage. Even though there actually was enough content for a full game this time around, the game was marketed as sort of a live service buzzword. Yet, if you look around on the Star Wars Battlefront subreddit, you'll see a lot of disappointed customers with how painstakingly slow the drip feed of post-launch content has been, and the things that are actually delivered are half-assed, like maps and new BBD bops only available in certain modes instead of across-the-board improvements. The only 2 Star Wars games for this generation of consoles have been of the FPS online multiplayer oversaturated genre, when there is a plethora of lore and characters and storylines to use across many different genres of games. Yet EA decided to go for the safe, easy play instead of making a diverse library of games that would no doubt have a larger fan base and get even more sales because it reaches across more different types of gamers. Those 2 lackluster titles are the only thing that EA has been able to shit out in 4 years, but lurking behind the scenes is a darker picture with not 1 but 2 canceled games. A single-player Star Wars video game was under development by Visceral Games, who made the Dead Space series of games, which was put on hiatus after EA's greed warped the 3rd incarnation into something it should not have been, with unrealistic sales expectations forcing gameplay mechanics, monetization, and shoehorning a co-op mode into an action horror niche audience. The Star Wars project, nicknamed Ragtag, was under the eye of Amy Hennig, who directed the Uncharted series, but the plug was pulled on it recently because EA thought that this type of game didn't have an audience, despite the fact that in 2018, the most highly acclaimed and biggest selling games were in fact linear single-player games such as God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, Spider-Man, and Far Cry 5, just to name a few. The problem with these type of games is that it's much harder to monetize campaign and single-player versus a multiplayer or co-op online affair, because EA just doesn't want money. It wants all of the money, in a kind of awkward, weird Spaceballs reference that actually parodies the Star Wars franchise anyway. So of course, that's the only direction that any games are allowed to go in. The studio was then shut down in the wake of this game cancellation, but the writing was on the wall after EA stopped making the Dead Space series and instead forced them to make games that were doomed to fail, like Battlefield Hardline, which I'll get into later. Alongside the development of this Ragtag project was another studio, EA Vancouver, which had originally been helping Visceral on that title, pivoted to a concept that fits more the description of generic open-world game that's much more highly monetizable. This project was codenamed Orca, and earlier this week it was revealed that this project was also canceled because EA wouldn't have been able to reap the benefits of said game in any soon enough time for them. Instead, they're going to pour resources into a smaller scale project that will be unbaked and rushed out the door, released sometime in 2020, which coincidentally are when the next generation of consoles that are already obsolete in terms of hardware will be released. There is one last-ditch attempt to actually have one good Star Wars game in this generation, and that is with Respawn Entertainment making Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order to be released in the holidays of this year, which is actually a single-player game, and with how good the campaign of Titanfall 2 is, I still think that there's hope here, and I'm also guessing that's why EA shit-canned the Visceral project, because we can't have two games where you don't wring your customers' wallets for everything that's in it. The problem, however, is that after a year of constant updates to Titanfall 2, when 2018 rolled around, there was basically radio silence from Respawn Entertainment on that game, probably because EA pulled them off of the IP to make this new Star Wars game, leaving the sequel to Titanfall having a ton of missed opportunity in terms of rounding out the game after EA previously fucked its launch by sandwiching it between two juggernaut FPS franchises with Battlefield the week before and Call of Duty the week after. There's a game that isn't included in the 10-year challenge photo, which is Star Wars The Old Republic, which was released in 2011 by EA's very own studio BioWare prior to its Mass Effect series that also, by the way, got fucked by EA's publisher greed and going on hiatus. BioWare lead developers have expressed interest in making an updated version of Knights of the Old Republic. However, EA instead assigned the studio to the upcoming Anthem game, which is basically a Destiny ripoff that has less people excited than Activity Time in an old folks home because, of course, EA is chasing trends instead of setting them. Fans of the Star Wars franchise certainly aren't happy with this exclusivity deal, and it obviously can't be good for Disney, who have somehow been pumping out movies at a faster rate than video games. But there's also people that have worked on those movies that have commented that this exclusivity deal isn't good for the Star Wars brand, which could negatively affect the franchise on the whole, including box office sales. But I'm not a Star Wars fan. However, I am a fan of Battlefield, and with that foundation out of the way, how does this absolute butchering of the Star Wars license impact a franchise that I am actually a fan of? The only two Star Wars games actually released during the exclusivity deal have both been made by developers DICE, which coincidentally are also the developers of the Battlefield games. The most recent 4 DICE-developed games are 2 Battlefront titles, Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5, with one title alternating between the two series each year since 2015. This isn't a lot of time to make these large-scale games, so to keep the usual 2-year between Battlefield releases, someone else needed to step in while DICE was developing Battlefront to be released in 2015. EA decided that Visceral Games should step away from the Dead Space series in order to develop a Battlefield game called Hardline that was doomed to fail from the start since it didn't have an audience to appeal to, as Battlefield players weren't going to play a cops and robbers Call of Duty-esque spinoff, and Call of Duty players weren't going to bother looking at a Battlefield title. Even though I liked the game for what it was, it's now an afterthought in the Battlefield franchise because it was more like a Battlefield expansion akin to Vietnam to Bad Company 2 than a standalone game that justified a $60 base price and another $50 season pass that fans of the series were just not going to have any of that fucking nonsense. Of course, after pulling the dev studio Visceral out of its wheelhouse by forcing them to make an FPS game instead of a third-person single-player campaign and putting Dead Space on the shelf, it then threw the studio at the single-player game that was subsequently canceled. And thus, that's how that studio fucking died off. EA's shitty decisions completely destroyed that development company. Meanwhile, DICE only had 1 year after the launch of the original Battlefront reboot to make the next Battlefield game. That time crunch definitely showed with Battlefield 1, which was, although a critical and commercial success, it was bereft of content that was eventually needed to be padded out behind another $50 premium pass. Sound familiar? In 2018, Battlefield 5 launched, albeit 1 month later than anticipated, with the promise of it being a live service. Also sound familiar? This live service promise wasn't delivered with Star Wars Battlefront 2, and so far it's the same mixed bag with Battlefield 5, the Panzerstorm map that's only available in one fucking game mode, so I've almost never played on it before, a practice range that's more useless than fallopian tubes on a lesbian since you can't even use your own personalized weapons in it, because the practice range was definitely shed out to mark off a checklist item, and half of these, quote, new weapons are just ones ported from the previous Battlefield title. Additionally, there are so many missing features in the new game from the previous stripped-down Battlefield 1 title, like no ability to team switch or even a team balancer after an almost 18-month delay in the prior title, mind you, no CTE to test patches on to prevent the 2-step forward, 1-step backwards experience, no incursions, a horrific UI menu design, and other things promised during the reveal that are in the coming soon black hole, like body dragging, tank personalization, and more. It's clear that this game was Matthew McConaughey not ready for launch. There's a reason why recent Battlefield games look a a lot like Battlefront games and vice versa. EA's absolutely recalculous mismanagement of the Star Wars license has forced DICE to work on reboots of games that it didn't even make in the first place because it's the only development company under its belt that's capable of putting together a game of this magnitude. There's a clear negative impact on the Battlefield franchise, with the last two titles being woefully underwhelming in terms of how little content and other features are available in the game. Battlefield 1 got more boring than the first season of Breaking Bad after a short amount of time because there was nothing left to unlock, nothing to go for at all unless you paid extra to get the paywalled content. Battlefield 5 has much more to obtain, however, countless aggravating bugs like the lack of company coin accrual to prevent unlocking that said more content, among others that are introduced with each patch, along with the paltry number of maps and decent modes, considering that Frontlines is broken beyond fuck, Grand Operations doesn't make any sense with the third round being the only one that matters. Mix this all together in a shit stew, and sometimes it's impossible to play that game, despite me liking how the gameplay feels compared to the previous Battlefield title. Since I am a selfish motherfucker, please Disney, remove EA's exclusivity from the Star Wars franchise, not because of the lack of decent Star Wars games, but because I'm a fan of the Battlefield franchise, and it's taken a giant shit since Battlefield 4. The supercalifragilisticexpialidocious mismanagement of developer assets that EA has undertaken since getting this license has directly impacted my favorite types of games, including Respawn Entertainment working on Jedi Fallen Order instead of updates to Titanfall 2, or even new development on Titanfall 3, another series of games that are among my best ofs, as well as how badly the past 3 Battlefield games have been. What do you think? Let me know down below. I've been the Schwaz27, out like the Saints. Thanks, refs. Until next time.